This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Dorcheha and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. This podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael.
Today's conversation continues our tefillah series with a zoom in on the morning blessings that are gender specific. A man blessing God for not making him a woman, and a woman blessing God for making her according to his will. This episode also connects to a broader thread of Women Talking Mitzvot, how we navigate Jewish text and liturgy that can be uncomfortable when viewed in a modern light. Hi, Shana.
Hi, Yosefa.
A few weeks ago, we released an episode on Birkot HaShachar, the blessings we say in the morning. And we made a decision at the time to deliberately skip over the series of 3 brachot where we bless God over aspects of our identity. We bless God that we are neither non-Jews, She-Asani goy, nor bondsmen, She-Asani eved, or shivcha, depending if you're a woman who says that nosach. Traditionally, men then conclude the series with the bracha She-Asani Isha. Blessed are you, Hashem, who did not make me a woman. While women recite the bracha She-Asani Kirtzono, blessing God who made me according to his will. And we wanted to devote a separate discussion to these last brachot so that we could spend time really understanding their meaning on a deeper level and also addressing some of the broader questions that they raise with regard to how we grapple with texts that can be challenging for us. Do you remember, Shana, the first time you noticed that men and women don't make the same bracha in the morning?
So I come from a girl's house. I'm the oldest of 4 sisters. And therefore, I feel like I was shielded somewhat in my childhood from any contrast between what men and women do or what men and women say. It wasn't something that I face in my home. But growing up in New York, I did go to co-ed elementary school. And there we davened in the morning together. So both in nursery school and then later in the early grades of elementary school, the boys would all say this bracha together, and then that was followed by the girls saying their bracha. So from when I was very little, I knew that there were 2 different brachot, but like a lot of things in childhood, it was kind of like, okay, it's just what it is, it's a given. Didn't think much about it, really just accepted it. And I was trying in preparation for this episode to really dig back into my memory, which is not amazing these days, and think about when is the first time that I started to think about it. And I happened on this memory from, I think, 35 years ago. I must have been in 4th or 5th grade. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir from Israel came to Great Neck, and there was a big event in the local Reform temple. And our elementary school performed, the choir performed at the event. And in the lead up to that, we had a bunch of dress rehearsals that were in the temple. And I remember sitting in the pews while other boring speakers were doing their part and being genuinely curious about the siddur that was in front of me, and opening it up and finding that there was one bracha that men and women said, and it wasn't either of the brachot that I was familiar with. I think it was something I don't remember exactly, but maybe She-Asani b'tzalmo, that God made me in his image. Whatever it was, I remember being wow, first of all, that is one of the first times that I really thought about denominations and not just different buildings, different temples, synagogue, a shul or whatever, but there's actually real differences. And coming home and speaking to my father about it, on an intellectual level, why is it that they changed the bracha, or why do we say different things? But it wasn't something that emotionally bothered me. It was wow, I start to really contemplate issues. On an emotional level, I think the first time that I found myself really being, bothered somewhat is when I started thinking about what are my boys, I have 4 boys, what are my sons thinking about when they say this bracha? And I raised it one time at the dinner table on a Friday night. I said,
I want to come for dinner, Shana.
Yeah, I just said, what, I'm curious, guys, what do you think about what's on your mind? And first of all, I was actually stunned, maybe because we live in Isha and they understand the bracha, the words of the tefillah, but they actually all had a response. They all had some way of explaining to themselves what they think about when they say these words, blessing God for not making them a woman. One of them, it was like so obvious to him. It's like, what do you mean? Of course, it's about the fact that like men don't have to be pregnant and have the children. And he was pretty young at the time. Like they ranged in age from 10 to 16 when I asked them this. And it was like, it was so pashut for him. Like for sure, that's what it's about. Another one I remember discussed the fact that men don't have the same concerns or preoccupations over clothing in the sense of like the laws of snood and the parameters of what they could wear, which, he's my kid. So like I'm sure he heard discussion about that in the house or on the phone with students or whatever. Another one in a different direction over clothing, the fact that men aren't as preoccupied with like how they present themselves and makeup and nails and the styles and what they're wearing. And he's like, oh, thank God I don't have to deal with that. And the fourth one went in the direction which I think a lot of our early sources go in, like the Tosafta talks about this and the Yerushalmi discusses this. He went in the direction of that he's grateful that in Judaism, it's just easier to be a man. He didn't say it's better. I remember like being struck by that. He didn't say it's better. He said it's easier, like just it's more natural, or the opportunities are available, or I could count in a minyan, or I could lean for the tzibur, which he really enjoyed doing. And there was something about his answer that, again, connects into what we see in sources, which is about perhaps this bracha is a man expressing his gratitude for being obligated in more mitzvot than women are, which is something that you and I discussed a little bit in episode 2, that men do, in fact, have more mitzvot that they're obligated in than women do. That is objectively true. On the other hand, like it could be hard, to hear whether it's your son or your husband or your colleague or your friend get up and say a bracha where he blesses God straight out for not making him a woman. I think it could be for a technical reason, and yet oftentimes if it's said with a feeling of like superiority, especially because of how the bracha is phrased, I think that can be a difficult experience for some women, on the receiving end of that.
I just want to emphasize in what you said that really the idea that men are thanking God for being obligated in more mitzvot is the main understanding of this bracha. Meaning all the things your son said, I think, are very natural reflections, and I'm sure it reflects the ideas that many men have about this bracha. But we have, the Tur and the Beit Yosef, and the Shulchan Aruch also afterwards, right? Same person as the Beit Yosef, really go in that direction, that it has to do with the difference in mitzvah observance. So I just want to underscore that from like a source perspective. That's really how it's understood by most.
Absolutely. Is this something that you noticed when you were younger, or not really?
Sheena, I don't have the recesses of memory like you do. You complain about your failing memory, but to be quite honest, I don't think I ever came close to it. I have no recollection really of ever noticing. I'm sure it existed, right? Meaning I also was in a co-ed elementary school. We said brachot in the morning. I definitely didn't think about it. But I would say more than that, I also really don't have any emotional memory of hearing it and saying, oh, that bothers me. I don't. I never really thought about it. I thought about it a lot preparing for this episode, but I never thought about it. And I would say even more than that on a list of things that are hard for me or that I have a hard time with, this is not really on the list. You know what I'm saying? And I don't necessarily want to think about it more so that it's on the list. The list is long and intense in and of itself. So I would say that I definitely hear all of the challenge with the phrasing of the bracha, and we'll get more into that soon. But it's not something that necessarily bothers me. And I think that the question about this bracha is so intertwined with the question that we're dealing with in modernity in general right now, which is about semantics. And this question of when do semantics matter and when are they just semantics? I'll take maybe a loaded example, but even I only 2 years discovered that the phrase master bedroom isn't used anymore or is considered not politically correct. And I never in my life, hearing that word growing up, ever thought that it's connected to slavery. I never once made that connection. Again, it might just be that I'm not this example of the thoughtful human out there who thinks deeply about every word they say. Although I think that I'm pretty thoughtful on the spectrum of humans. And I never really thought about it. And then the question becomes, do we want to infuse people with that thought and then say we have to fix the way we speak? Or do we say that there's some things that are just objectively difficult and this is something that bothers many people and therefore it needs to shift? I think that the big difference, let's say, between the example of master bedroom versus She-Asani Isha is that I think that in the case of She-Asani Isha, we're talking here about half the population being women and the other population who might be disturbed by this phrasing, even if they're a man saying it. I think that we're talking about here a very large scope of it, of the population, and also that the question about the relationship between genders is one that's still being worked on.
Right.
And therefore the sensitivity sits in a different place than speaking about, again, I understand that racism is a very big topic and I'm not getting into politics right now, but the specific relationship of slavery is not one that in the Western world we're dealing with in the sense of where that phrase comes from. So I think the question about like what sensitivity is it hitting upon, what ears are hearing it is also an interesting piece. By the way, just as a funny phrase, I'll just say that in Hebrew, the phrase for it's called Yechidat Horim, is the parents' bedroom, which in itself also, of course, it reflects a value that there's two parents sleeping in there. And that's what it's called in I've built 2 homes in this country. Like, that's what it's called officially.
Yeah, right.
And so,
which carries its own loaded.
Exactly, that this is a home that has 2 parents. And in the broader world, they would look at that and say, oh, well, that's, inappropriate for all the single parent families.
And could be sensitive and painful if that is not your, reality. It's interesting what you're saying, because on the one hand, I also think about these issues because, like, when I moved to Israel, I discovered that the word ba'ali is my husband's. Like, my ba'al, my husband is a loaded word because ba'al in Hebrew literally means owner, like somebody who has possession of something. And the feeling of many women is that, like, that's not a phrase that they want to use when talking their spouse. I'm not in his ownership. I'm not in his, possession. I, on the one hand, like, personally, I never thought about it like that. And therefore, like, it's just like the word for husband. And I continue to use it, like, in my personal life. And on the other hand, I have become much more conscious of it. And when I'm in certain circles where people say ha'ishali or ishi, my man, kind of, so then I am more careful because I know what the connotations are. And really, I just want to say words matter. They do matter as much as we want to say, yeah, whatever, it's, it's just a word, it's just a phrase. I do think they affect us in subtle and not so subtle ways. And it's okay to admit sometimes when it bothers us. And the difference in terms of like a bracha of She-Asani Isha versus talking about a master bedroom or my ba'al is that especially young boys who are saying these brachot, you don't know what they're thinking.
Yeah, it's a consciousness molder when you say something from such a young age on a daily basis. I agree with you.
Especially if you understand the words that you're saying. So how you internalize it. So on the one hand, we don't want to become overly preoccupied, And on the other hand, it doesn't make us not from to be talking about this issue or to be thinking about how it affects the community that we live in.
When you're speaking about asking your sons how they experience that bracha, so the only man I've ever asked is my husband. I don't have sons of any kind of age like that. And he's the only person I've ever asked. And I will just say, without giving over too much information, I love my husband deeply, but he does not share a passion for a lot of these issues in the way that I do. Thank God we complete each other and we're not passionate on the exact same issues. But I definitely want to bring up his voice because I think that it's probably representational of so many, which is that he doesn't think about this, meaning he's not losing sleep over it. And I would even say more than that, that, as the years progressed, She-Asani Isha took on for him what one of your sons was saying, as he saw me through years of pregnancy and all different elements that are bound up in that stage of life. And so he would like use She-Asani Isha, like it was like a code word between us of like, I get to go walk up and walk out of the house today and you, I don't know, are in that situation or just gave birth. And it became kind of like a joke almost. It was like a little bit of like a keyword between us of like, yep, I just get to go walk off into the sun.
A joke, but actually from a place of sensitivity.
Yes.
And awareness.
Yes, it was Ki'ilu using a little bit like that rough phrasing of the bracha maybe, but with him being like, like our lives are different.
Right.
And it Dafka he became more aware of that, I think, over time.
Of that. I think also when you say a lot of men don't think about it, we're including in that men who are, amazing husbands or who are champions.
That wasn't clear.
Women, in all different realms. It's just that this is the nisach, this is the phrasing of the bracha, and it doesn't impact them. Not that they don't care.
Exactly. Of course. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important clarifier. I'd also say that when I see that other people aren't sensitive to something that I might be sensitive to, so sometimes it's a sign for me to say, chill out, Yosefa. It's fine. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's saying everybody is slumbering on this topic.
Yeah.
And the fact that they don't see it is a problem. And I think that's that place of choosing your battles or trying to figure out, so what is just semantics or what is, and we'll dig more into that. But I think that the example of Zevi of my husband is just an anecdote. But I think that what's particularly challenging in this bracha, as you mentioned almost before, is the fact that it's phrased in the negative, right? She-Asani, Isha, right? That I wasn't made a woman. And I think that itself is part of what could be a little bit jarring. Offensive, yeah. Offensive about this bracha. And I think first I also want to just ask ourselves, why is it phrased that way, right? Why is it phrased in that way? Again, we see that it's phrased similarly to the two brachot that come before it, right?
You have to see it as part of that package.
Exactly. She-Asani goy and She-Asani eved, if you're a man, or some women also say that phrasing also that we mentioned in that earlier episode. There are a few explanations for why it's phrased this way, but I think two are possibly more compelling. One is that it simply was the common way to express identity in the times of Chazal, and that's why it's reflected in those two earlier brachot as well. It could be that the negative was a common way to speak in the time of Chazal. Our modern ears hear negating somebody else's identity to affirm ours, and that feels harsh.
Right, especially in the cancel culture that we live in.
Exactly. But I think that it's very clear that Chazal weren't necessarily living in that same space. I think another piece that's really important here is the context of who's the opinion that speaks about these brachot. Rabbi Meir in Masechet Menachot tells us that ideally we want to try and make 100 brachot a day. It's an idea that I think many of us are familiar with, even obliquely, that chayav adam mevarech me'a brachot b'chol yom, and we have many different ways that we can try and make these brachot. Rabbi Meir is credited with being the author of this statement of actually these brachot we say in the morning. And so it's very possible that if we would have had sort of a catch-all bracha, right, of thank you Hashem for making me an Oved Hashem, then we would have put in it all three of the brachot we say individually, right? Both being that we're not made a Gentile, that we're not a slave, and that we're also not a woman. And so by making specific brachot, if we connect those two statements of Rabbi Meir, one in Menachot and one in Masechet Brachot, we maybe see this idea about why it's three specific, I would say almost negating identity markers. I don't know if any of these are so convincing necessarily, but I think that they may provide context to the reason why the bracha is phrased that way. For me, by the way, Shana, context is always so important.
Yeah.
Before I get riled up by something, and maybe the context, I'll still be frustrated by it, but it's important to think about it in that initial source context.
Mm-hmm. And I remember as a young girl that's what my father did when I first asked him about this, because he opened the Gemara for me and he showed me that Rabbi Meir was the one who coined the phrasing of this bracha. And he said to me that Rabbi Meir was married to Beria, one of the few women that's mentioned in the Gemara, that the Gemara tells us was a learned woman and scholarly and deeply engaged in the study of Torah. And my father said that he always thought about the fact that maybe Rabbi Meir, as the husband of somebody who faced the inherent tensions, especially in his time, of what it meant to be a woman who, on the one hand, was committed to her home and to raising her children, but on the other hand, really had a love and a passion for Torah that wasn't common in her time. And he saw that she didn't have the opportunities that he had, that perhaps that bracha was catching some kind of empathy or sensitivity that he had towards her situation in terms of expressing the fact that he didn't have to deal with those tensions that she did, which, as you said, we don't know what Rabbi Meir had in mind. But for me, that explanation was helpful, and also kind of made me think about it a couple of days ago when I was deep in the preparation for this episode. And of the episodes we've done, like, this has been more stressful for me just because it's a more loaded topic. And one of my sons walked into the kitchen and he's like, "What are you working on?" Because I was sitting in the middle of the kitchen as I was also trying to cook and whatever. And I was like, "Well, this episode on She-Asani, Isha." And I said to him, like, he's much older now, like, "Where are you? What do you think about when you say that bracha?" And he's like, maybe about the fact that I don't have to sit around doing a podcast and stress about this issue. Meaning, like, these issues for men, they're not weighing on them in the same way that they are for women. And that tension, I think that Rabbi Meir maybe saw that his wife was struggling with, perhaps, could also be part of it. As you spoke about, for me, really, the most challenging part is the negative phrasing. Like, even if men made a bracha where they thanked Hashem for making them men, I don't think we would experience it in the same way. Maybe it still wouldn't be the most pleasant, but we wouldn't experience it in the same way. And ideally, like, I haven't given so much thought for what I would want the bracha to be, like if men and women had separate brachot, what I would want men to say. But I do think about maybe it would be nice if we both said the same bracha, the bracha that we as women say in the morning, which is a bracha of She-Asani Kirtzono, blessing God for making us according to his will. I know a lot of women really appreciate that bracha, but like, that could be a bracha that both men and women could say that would maybe like smooth this over. But just I know that it's not a simple thing to change brachot, and I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon. But and I'm not even saying that needs to happen. It's just when I think about the brachot that we as women say, I think there is something meaningful about blessing Hashem for making us according to His will.
I think that the bracha itself that we say is also worth thinking about, right? Where this even came from. It's fascinating because we don't actually know where it came from. And when it shows up in, I would say, late Middle Ages, it's just sort of an assumption that that's what women are saying. And it's very possible, the Torah even says that women are accustomed to reciting this bracha. And it almost sounds like that women may have taken the initiative to say this bracha. We don't know. I didn't find so far.
They may have written it.
Yeah, they might have written it. And there are also many sidurim that were made for women throughout the ages. Sidurim that were sometimes also not in Hebrew. They were in their vernacular. If someone listening has any deeper knowledge on this, I'd love to hear. We definitely did a lot of research on this, but we don't have a clear source of where this bracha came from. And it's very possible this was a bracha like sort of for women, by women kind of thing. But certainly when it comes to the psika of the halacha, we know that this is the phrasing that has been accepted. And there's I think there's two ways that we can look at how to interpret this bracha, right? One of them is, I think, what you were hinting at, like a positive recognition of like that we're made in the divine image, right? She-Asani Kirtzono, it is a beautiful bracha. And the other one might be some sort of, why are you laughing?
Yeah, because right. See what the other one is. Oh, just like
the other one is sort of like a resignation of like, okay, I sort of accepted it that we're exempt from some mitzvot, but this is what God wanted. Do you know what I'm saying?
Because we don't bless She-Asani together. Like, we don't say the counter bracha that Hashem didn't make us a man. So
exactly. I think that
let's stick with the positive one.
We can stick with the positive one. There are several interpretations of how to understand this bracha. And I think all of them somewhat in the positive sense. And one of them that stands out is Rav Pinchas Horowitz of Frankfurt from the 18th century, where he speaks about the idea that originally, right, we were created sort of like a hybrid creature of Zachar v'Nekeva bara otam in the beginning of Sefer Breshit. And then the second chapter describes that we were created separately and that we were really our own being, right? Man was created and then woman is created in the world. And it could be that She-Asani Kirtzono, maybe that bracha is referring to that sort of creation, right? The woman being created entirely on her own. It might be an affirmation of her independent identity, separate from man. That's the ratzon, is the ratzon, the desire is the creation of woman herself, which I think is personally could be a nice idea. On a personal level, I can say that I deeply connect to the bracha of She-Asani Kirtzono because it always rings to me in the same tone of the bracha of She'akol that we make as sort of like our catch-all bracha. It's because when something is not specific enough that it was grown on a tree or the ground, right? And it's sort of the catch-all piece. And right, Shelo, Asani, Isha is very, very specific.
Okay.
And She-Asani, Kirtzono is lovely, but it speaks of something very generalized. And there's something about that tone that doesn't necessarily sit well with me. And that's where the bracha usually hits me. Now, I said earlier, it's not something that I, generally feel strongly about. I don't think about it every single morning. But I think that if I sit and really stare at that bracha, that's sort of the association that arises in me.
I hear that, especially when it's in contrast. The same way that Shehakol Niya Bivaro is in contrast to Borei Priya Eitz, like a very specific bracha on a fruit that grew from the tree. So here too, it could just feel like too generic, so to speak. I guess I personally don't find myself in that space so much because I'm usually not, because I'm usually not in shul and I'm saying it on my own, so you kind of forget that there is another bracha that men say, it's not like that elementary school experience, and when you're saying it on your own in the privacy of your home or the intimacy of your own tefillah, so, you're able to kind of think of it as its own bracha.
Even though there's a list of brachot, Shana, and the woman's bracha is always printed smaller.
Yeah, it's true. Hence what siddur you're using. Yeah, no, so I totally hear that. Honestly, for me, what's most important in all of this is just the educational piece, that young men and young women be educated on the meaning of these brachot and that they're not used as a fertile ground for chauvinism. I lived here in Alunshva where one time we were at a B'nai Akiva gathering, and part of what happens in B'nai Akiva are the boys and the girls are screaming these chants at each other. It's kind of like color war year round, and all of a sudden Gina and I noticed that the boys, these little boys, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, they're staring down the girls and they're saying Tsela, Tsela. We're like, what? And then we're like, oh my gosh, they're calling them a rib, from that creation story. I'm like, maybe only in La Lunchwood is that a diss, but why am I bringing that up here? Because it's a Tnuah Murevet, right? It's a co-ed youth group. Everyone gets along. Everyone's there's no the girls aren't put down. They're not second-class citizens, and still in our communities there's this underlying chauvinistic attitude sometimes that I just think we need to be aware of, and we have to be sensitive towards, and we have to really do our part to educate in terms of what the true meaning here is. And one of the things that I really appreciate is that Rav Chaim David Halevi, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv at the close of the 20th century, he wrote about how men's obligation in more mitzvot is not a sign of superiority. It's a privilege, and that men should be careful to keep this in mind when reciting the bracha, that their obligation in mitzvot doesn't mean that somehow they're more worthy in the eyes of God or that somehow they're more than or whatever, but that, they have the privilege and also the responsibility to think about that when they're saying the bracha. And I imagine he was motivated to write this by what he saw around him, by all kinds of incidents like the one that I described. And I think it would be great if, in our Sidurim, there was, a note, the same way they say, before Shema, have special intent to expect God's, yoke of whatever upon you. I don't see in our Sidurim, and in prep for this, I really checked a lot. And even in our very modern Sidurim, published by our modern Orthodox communities that have all different kinds of commentary and annotations and explanations, I couldn't find anything on this topic. They kind of just ignore it, which on the one hand I appreciate. I'd rather they not address it than say some kind of explanation that feels apologetic or whatever. And on the other hand, I was just flabbergasted. Nobody addresses this all over the world, little boys and girls, men and women, all people of all ages. And you comment on everything and there's no comment on this. I just think our community could do better. We could educate and we could encourage a certain intent when these brachot are being said. I don't know. What do you think?
No, it's interesting. First of all, I know there's a whole genre of women's sidurim even today that I can't say it's ever spoken to me. So I've never bought them, but I'm actually curious what they say in them. if they have some sort of special note, or their way of printing the women's brachot in the morning is just simply by printing it standardized.
Man's bracha.
Right, exactly. It's not the man's bracha, but that's also interesting. Look, I think that because you mentioned earlier that the Reforms Sidur, right, initially that nosach was created by Geiger, but they shifted the nosach there, and I think that sets a very negative precedence for
scared to touch it.
Yeah, they're scared to touch it. I think that's probably sitting there like in the backdrop. I think that in a somewhat ironic way, even adding a note could sound somewhat apologetic, and I think that a traditional community, meaning an observing community, might see that as something that feels uncomfortable because it reflects negatively on the tradition. And so there might be a desire or a preference to living with a certain degree of cognitive dissonance between the Isha we see today and the bracha, or whatever that dissonance is for each person saying it. There might almost be a preference for that over making a statement that makes seem like a negative judgment on the bracha.
Yeah, I can understand that. Like somehow even adding a node is somehow questioning our ancestors or questioning our tradition. And at the same time, I feel like we have to acknowledge that times change, and obviously halacha, there's things that stay the same, and at the same time, one of the most beautiful parts of our tradition and our religion and our halacha is that we know how to engage with the times that we live in. And if someone already, like Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in the 19th century, in his Siddur, could write about the fact that these blessings are not thanks, that nobody should think that we're thanking God for not making us non-Jews, or we're thanking God for not making us slaves or women, but he writes there that rather these brachot call upon us to contemplate the task which God has imposed upon us by making us free Jewish men, and to pledge ourselves to do justice to this mission. So if he could write that in the 19th century, because we know that he was contending with the Reform movement and the consequences for the beginning of that movement on his community, I think it would be wonderful, though, if today our Sidurim had a note in it reminding men that they could use this bracha as an opportunity to heighten their own awareness that, yes, they have certain privileges, not in a way of like the woke check your privilege, you have to feel bad that something's wrong with you and you have opportunities, but no, in the sense of like, well, we're aware that our religious lives are less in tension with the rest of our modern life than maybe our female counterparts. And we are grateful for that, and also simultaneously committed to being sensitive to the people around us and to the communities that we live in, and to taking responsibility for wanting our communities to develop in certain ways. I think that would be something welcome, and that would be something positive. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're putting down our tradition as much as we're acknowledging that the world has evolved and the world has changed, and is a yofi, how wonderful that our tradition knows how to respond to that. So that's something that I would appreciate seeing. Beyond that, I think a Beit Knesset, a shul, can also follow the practice that I know many Batei Knesset in Israel do, which is that they begin the out loud recitation of Shacharit, of the morning prayer, after these brachot. So as opposed to having a chazan, a shaliach sibor, get up in front of the shul and say this bracha out loud, which again could just, make a woman who's present feel less comfortable, or feel less invited, or feel less seen, because no bracha is being said on her behalf. It's like a little small thing that our community could do also to make shul a more inviting place for women. And lastly, I just want to give space to all the people out there, men and women, who may still feel that even after all the explanations and all the understandings, whatever, that they still don't love these brachot, and they're still not brachot that they totally resonate with. And that's also okay. Like, we can say that there's things in our tradition that like maybe don't speak to us 100%. And at the same time, we could continue to say them while also being in dialogue with halachic authorities about what we could do to help our communities, best navigate these issues. So those are practical things. I'll share that's something that I have found personally to be impressive, and also for me deeply moving, is that for the last 12 years, I've been invited to speak in 2 different yeshivot, in Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi in Yerushalayim and Yeshivat Har Tzion, Gush, in Alon Shvet, to discuss with their talmidim, with their male talmidim, the experience of being a modern Orthodox woman in the 21st century. And I always start the conversation with them by asking them if they could reflect on some of the areas of their religious life that they just take for granted, that are part of their day-to-day experience, that the women their age might experience differently or may even find challenging in different ways. Now, I'm not looking for their pity, and I say that to them. I'm not coming to be like, oh, we're miskinot and, we need your compassion or whatever. That's not the point. My point in this exercise is to get them thinking and to open their eyes to little things around them that they may not have paid attention to and noticed before, to really put themselves, I would say, in the shoes of their friends, of their sisters, of their mothers. And it's fascinating. Once you ask them to do that, I'm always really impressed, even blown away by the things that they're able to say, ranging from women may not have the same learning opportunities available to them, whether it's summer programs or the level of learning in different, yeshivot, midrashot experiences. They'll talk about what it might feel like to, be behind a mechitza. They'll talk about their friends or their sisters' motives being questions, which is something that, I know definitely I faced at different times in my life. And inevitably, someone will always raise the issue of difficult texts. They'll say, wow, I'm thinking about what it must be like to hear She-Asani Isha, or to read a passage in the Gemara that really, could be uncomfortable. And that gets them curious. Then they start asking me, how do you navigate and respond to texts that are not always comfortable for you to read as a woman? And I think it's a big topic. How do we approach this?
I think it's a big topic, and I think that, like so many of these topics that relate to our lives, it's one that's still in motion also, meaning both how we think about it, how it meets the population, who's meeting texts right now, right? I think that that's also a big piece, meaning many young men and women can possibly go many years and never come up against this question because they're not necessarily looking at those texts in the face, right? It depends how much they're traditionally steeped in that kind of learning. And so I think it's so varied how people meet this question or when they meet it. I would say that different than what I said before about the bracha, that this one I meet all the time. I meet this all the time. And it's a funny thing devoting yourself to a life of study of text that you weren't the intended audience of. It's like a constant daily. I'm the other. I'm constantly inserting myself in a conversation that I wasn't really part of. And I'm very aware of that. It's very much there. And I think that there's a natural dissonance that arises. Certainly any women who are studying Torah Shabbat Peh seriously, right? You meet yourself as a category, right? It's very different than the way that we
Nashim Avadim.
Yeah, and we're in a category with others, and there's a lot there. In an earlier episode, I believe it was also episode 2, I brought in a piece by Rav Eliezer Berkovitz that for me is sort of seminal, definitely at this point in my career, that he writes about his last book that he writes about women and Judaism. And that the idea there, it highly contextualizes Chazal in the sense that it looks at them in their time period, and it looks at the women as they were living life then. And while there's a very important need to acknowledge the fact that the halachic sources also shift over time with the slow shifting status of women, that doesn't only happen in the 19th century, meaning that there are certain halachot that simply are never really practiced because it wasn't relevant for women's lives and for the way that families were structured. So there are subtle changes, and then there's obviously the big bang changes that happen in the past 200 years. But that, you have to look at these texts, that they are to a certain degree going to be reflective of the time period in which they were molded, both in terms of men's attitudes and also to what women were like in those times, which were simply very different than what women are to a certain degree, than what women are like in the modern world.
They can only speak to what they see, to what they know. It reminds me of a passage in a fantastic book called If All the Seas Were Ink by Ilana Kershan, who wrote a memoir on her experience of learning Daf Yomi, which in of itself is like, wow, that's a chiddush. That's something new in our world, that women are part of the Daf Yomi cycle and that learning. And she wrote about her experience. And she has a passage in there where she writes, perhaps a Jewish woman of the 21st century has more in common with a Jewish man of rabbinic times than with his wife. After all, she writes, women in the Talmud rarely owned property or lived independently, whereas I and many women like me earn a salary, have my own apartment, and participate fully in the social and political life of my community. So what she's doing there and what you're saying is that the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that they were speaking about the women of their time, which may not have, 100% overlap with the women that we know with ourselves. The challenge, though, is that sometimes halachot are drawn from these texts.
Exactly. And that it's almost easier to sift out hashkafic statements about women or men that are no longer reflective of what women and men are like. But it gets sticky when those statements or the assumptions underlying the statements also end up molding certain halachic realities.
Exactly.
And that tension is there, right? That tension is there in the way marriage is right. Performed in the Jewish world and the way that divorce is performed in the Jewish world.
Meaning that if we understand that these statements were made in a certain context, so they could help us, think about what we want our intentions to be when we read these. But the fact that these shaped some of the moldings of our crucial halachot that we are still needing to contend with.
Yeah. And I don't think we need to lessen the fact that there's a tension there. There's a tension in the way that weddings are performed, a tension in the way, obviously, that divorce is actuated in the world. And it's certainly any of the halachot directly relating to women, and also not only many other halachot that relate to the world are relying on certain basic assumptions about the world. And it's not just assumptions about women that are no longer completely accurate and aligned with the world. And I would say the work and the art of halachic development over time is to bring halacha in alignment with the world while not compromising on its traditional values. And that's happening every day. That's happening every day in the way that people are living halacha. It's happening every day in the way that those who mold the halacha itself from top down are contending with it. And I don't think that we have to minimize that. I will also say that friends of mine who are, deep in the like Gemara halacha space as well, sometimes they say that they find it empowering to engage with those texts, meaning I'm inserting myself in there. I'm inserting myself in that conversation. And I'm also part of the very actual real life dialogue surrounding these issues. And so they feel that there's a real tikkun. There's some sort of,
they're part of the change.
They're part of that change of those spaces. And that to them actually feels empowering. You read out that piece by Alana Kirshen, who's a wonderful, wonderful person, wonderful writer. She just put out a new memoir that's called Children of the Book, about reading books to your children before bedtime. Yeah. And a piece that stands out to me was written by Rabbanit Sarah Wachenfeld. She wrote it in 2020. Sarah is the chief learning officer for Sefaria, I'm sure a website that some of our listeners are familiar with. And she wrote it on the heels of the first Women's Daf Yomi Siyum, which was spearheaded by Rabbanit Michelle Farber and many other institutions as well that were part of it. And it was here in Yerushalayim. Now her name is associated with Hadran. But in any event, she writes the following, Sarah. She says, perhaps it is precisely this re-envisioning of all male spaces that has enabled the flourishing landscape of women's Torah study that exists today. Again and again, women who love learning Torah envision themselves in the Shakla V'Tarya and the Patei Midrash and all the stories. We looked at rooms that had no women and imagined ourselves there. We looked at a world of serious Talmud study and fell in love, and that love helped us see ourselves in those spaces and in those conversations. And then in the continuation of the article, she quotes a piece of Torah that was spoken by Rabbanit Michal Tukuchinsky, whose name will come up again, I'm sure, on future episodes. And Rabbanit Michal said the following, but Sarah wrote it in her article, that this ability to imagine ourselves sharing a Beit Midrash with others who have loved Torah just as we do is what enabled women to take their place in the contemporary Beit Midrash. Living in different centuries in Rabbeinu Tam, Rambam, and Rav Chaim, and indeed they lived in different centuries from one another, did not stop Rav Soloveitchik from inhabiting the same Beit Midrash with all of them simultaneously. And so she says that so too we can relate to Rav Soloveitchik's words and can be inspired by visiting the graves of great Torah scholars and not be inhibited by the fact that they were all men. Okay, meaning I just want to translate that into, I think, our own idea, which is that first of all, anybody who engages in studying traditional text is inviting themselves into a conversation that they weren't actually part of. Meaning this took place centuries earlier. I'm the continuation of that. And she says that, yes, just like you have all of the sages throughout the centuries and the Rabbanim who brought themselves into conversation with those who weren't living at their time period, so too women are bringing themselves into that space. And I think that the big difference here is just a matter of tone, meaning are you're bringing yourself in with love. You're bringing yourself in with a respect for that tradition.
Yes.
And to me, that's like the big difference between these different ideas. The actual practical outcome is not so different. But the question is, are we bringing ourselves in with frustration and anger as being our overarching tone? Because there's going to be dissonance and frustration when you're in this situation. It's sort of hard to avoid. Or are we able to do it with that sense of like a love and a respect for the tradition?
I also just want to say that you touched on this, but like the fact that women weren't part of the conversation is not unique to Judaism or to our tradition. Like, this is a historical reality. Women did not have the same kinds of education across the board that we are blessed to have today. So if you are a young woman studying medicine today, it's also true that the medical literature, like largely was not written by women. So too, if you're studying law, so too, if you're studying history, it wasn't written by women. Yeah. And it's not something unique to Judaism. It's something that we as women have to contend with. And I think that helps a little bit also diffuse a little bit of the frustration. It softens it because you're like, okay, on the one hand, we're blessed to live in the 21st century and we're a part. And on the other hand, right, that highlights the fact that it wasn't always the case. But then we're able to approach it more with that love and that respect when we realize that it wasn't something unique to the rabbis.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. I think that if I could just be on the other side for one moment, which is that there is something difficult sometimes about sitting yourself down at a table that you weren't really invited to be at, or that there is still negative feelings about you being there. Yeah, there's no setting for you. And so at this point, there is a bit of a setting, right? We have, I would say, 2 generations at this point of women who have been learning Torah seriously as groups, right? There's always been individuals, but as groups. But I guess what I really want to look at that and say that my deepest, truest belief is that when enough women sit themselves down at that table, no one's going to remember that there wasn't a setting for them initially. Meaning, it just becomes transformed, right? It's a different kind of meeting between souls and minds, and I think that we can transform the way that all sides of the spectrum look at all these issues, and I think that's an important piece. Also, I want that. I want sitting down at that table to be moving and empowering and engender respect. And I understand the challenge of that. Really, really, I do.
I also want to add that I think it already is. Rabbanit Esti Rosenberg, who's the Rosh Beit Midrash of our Beit Midrash of Migdal Oz, wrote an article about 15 years ago for a volume of the Orthodox Forum that was titled The Next Generation of Modern Orthodoxy. That's the name of the volume. And she wrote an article about the influence that women's Batei Midrash have had on the world, like their development and the role that they're playing. And the end of the article also specifically talks about the influence that they have had on men's yeshivot and on the learning that men are doing. And she quotes a story where a teacher in her Beit Midrash told her that because he is now teaching women the topics that he was teaching in Migdal Oz, he says the questions that I am finding them to be asking me on a topic that he was teaching for years in the yeshiva are different than the questions that had been raised by men. And he said, as a result, he began teaching the men differently in light of the questions that he was receiving from the women. And Esti speaks about how these new perspectives, there's like a flow going back and forth between women's Batei Midrash and men's Batei Midrash that everyone ends up being enriched by. And I remember my own husband, Judah, when he taught in the advanced program, the Tochnit Mekademet in Migdal Oz. So one of the years he had to teach Kiddushin. And I remember as he was preparing the Masachet, he said to me, I learned this Masachet before. And yet the questions that I find myself anticipating, because he was teaching a group of mostly married women and older women who were like, thoughtful. And he said that they're forcing me to think about all kinds of things that I never noticed, or all kinds of things that I have to formulate differently, or I have to be sensitive towards. And I think that's amazing. It's definitely widening the kind of experiences that people are having with learning. And also another example I was thinking about is that in Yeshivat Har Tzion in Gushir, a bunch of years ago, they learned Masechet Ketubot, which has a lot of discussion about rape. And they felt at some point that like you walk around the Beit Midrash and you hear Charuto like talking about, like, oh, when this woman was raped and when that happens and whatever. And they took a step back and they're like, wow, this is a human tragedy, rape, and the fact that it exists in the world. And they invited the female director of a women's rape crisis for religious women to come to speak to the students about what that experience is like, so that they could like feel a little bit, on an emotional level, the kinds of things that they're learning about and discussing. And I don't think that would have happened, like 50 years ago, before women were part of the conversation about learning. The fact that women are in the Bati Midrash and they are discussing and writing about these topics changes the way everybody thinks about them and has to approach them. And I'm hopeful that that's just going to continue. We know when we've spoken about that change is slow and that things evolve over time. That's true not only in the religious world, but also in the religious world. And for me, at least, when I think about these topics, I try to be very honest with my kids, with my sons, and with my daughter, and model for them that it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be upset sometimes. As long as, like, you could hold that together with all the beauty and all the things that you like, like we don't have to cancel things. We don't have to give apologetics just to make ourselves better. Like, two things could be true. We could have frustrations and we could feel like things are difficult or not the way that we would ideally like them to be. And we could still embrace a religious life that's rich and meaningful. And I think empowering people that they kind of choose how to respond, and reminding them that like life is complicated and people are complicated and religion is complicated, and and giving room to that, giving room to the disappointment, and at the same time trying to steer or stay away from too much cynicism, because it's not productive, because it doesn't help us. I think that ability to live with the tensions, which I know you always comment that I use that word a lot, but for me, very real. Like, I really feel, for me, living with tension means that like two things are really, really, really important to me. And it would be simpler if I could just kind of like X one out, because then life would be, like easier. And yet, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I really feel like traditional. And at the same time, there's parts of me that are progressive, or I feel very, very rooted. And that doesn't mean that I'm not forward thinking or committed and open-minded, whatever, submissive. I think I'm submissive at the end of the day, but I'm still intellectually curious. And maybe a big tension that I hold is that tension of like being frustrated and also being fulfilled. Like, how could you be frustrated and fulfilled at the same time? But I really, really, really feel that together, together, that I could be fulfilled even in my frustration. So I know we like to end with a takeaway. And for me, I guess the takeaway that's on my mind is that with all that, I think we still don't have a reason why we can't educate better. Meaning, yes, so there's tensions, but let's educate better and let's try to affect the culture and the nature of the discourse in our community, like how we talk about these topics in our schools, in our camps, in our shuls, in our youth movements, at our Shabbos table. Can we do it in ways that both empower and give perspective to women and to men? So something I really would like to continue to work on.
So if I go back to the initial place we started this conversation, I would say that I still am not losing a lot of sleep over the phrasing of the bracha. Okay, that's my honest piece on that first part. I think that I give so much respect to those for whom it's really uncomfortable for them. I would say in my list of sensitivities, it's not necessarily sitting on that bracha. But I do want to just add one little story. I know you're usually the better storyteller, but I have one story that came up so recently and I couldn't not share it. It's exactly about what you're saying. I'm involved in a Talmud Torah in my neighborhood. We have shiurim every afternoon for kids. But the point is that last week they had a hitvadut, which I don't know, you have no idea how to translate that phrase, but they had sort of like an oneg evening. And it was advertised by the person who initiated it that it was a hitvadut for noar, which translates into youth, okay? It's a non-gender phrase, okay? Right, Hebrew, we're genderized language here. And it was hitvadut for noar. One of the fathers who was involved in the organization of this Talmud Torah asked on the WhatsApp, is this for boys and girls? Right? He asked. And I said, no matter what the answer is, you must know that if you write noar, youth, it sounds like it's for everybody. So if you only mean it to be for boys, please write line'arim or libanim, right? There's a very clear way to write boys.
Let's give another example. Like, if you're sitting in a shiur and someone says, I think I once heard Rivka Press-Schwartz talk about this, like you're sitting in a shiur and someone says, Jews wear tefillin.
Right.
It's like, yeah, like half of Jews, are obligated to wear tefillin, or someone comes to a Beit Midrash for women and gives a whole shiur about how much they love the mitzvah of tefillin or the mitzvah of tzitzit without realizing, like, it's not resonating. So you're talking about just in our language.
Meaning, I'm saying the bracha itself is, I don't necessarily think about it so much, but the question of how does our language represent or underrepresent who we are as a people is something that I think very much about. And I think that it is significant, because what that means is that parents or young women who are looking at the WhatsApp and say, oh, noar isn't me.
Right.
And I don't want them ever to think that. And I also don't want the boys to think that.
Right.
I don't want anybody. And so the question of language and inclusivity in our language, I think about tremendously. And I think that what I would say as my takeaway is that I really, really, really love the idea that we might have written ourselves into this bracha, that maybe the idea of She-Asani Kirtzono was something that women wrote. And I really want women to continue putting themselves into the conversation. It's not simple, Shayna. I'm still saying that where we are now, and we could talk about all the years that, the generations before us, but it's still a challenge for me. I would say almost weekly, I come up with something that's a challenge and that I want to come at it with positivity. And it's okay that they didn't save a place for me, but I'm going to put myself there. It's constant. But I really, really want to encourage women and to say that you are part of this conversation, and that the more you put yourself at that table, everybody will slowly forget that we weren't the quote unquote intended audience. Because I want to go back to something that you said that I think I'll never forget. Now it's part of my life, is that we're all here in the eyes of God. And the fact that as a society, the table has been set differently for a long time. Okay, we're here and we're living in a different time, and that's okay. But we're all here in the eyes of God. And I deeply believe that with every fiber of my being, and my life reflects that. And I want to encourage women to keep putting yourself at that table, whether it's your vad in shul, or the organizational activities in the neighborhood, or
your Shabbos table.
Your Shabbos table, and where you all of those pieces. Speak up, in so many moments where women could be a part of that conversation. And so I get that for some it's uncomfortable and it's not right for them. There are many men who that's uncomfortable for and it's not right for them. But I really believe that we are wanted here, and we have so much to contribute. So I just want to encourage everyone to pull up a seat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shayna. Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance with all of them. You can contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. That's womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.